Some families during the Depression ate the same sandwich 5 days straight, not because they liked it, but because one jar of something cheap could carry a household of 6 through an entire week, and county relief records from the era back that up in black and white. Rural public health pamphlets distributed to struggling households pushed the sandwich hard for a reason most people never think about. It needed no fuel to cook, no dishes to wash, and no ice to keep it fresh past lunchtime. Documented oral history collections gathered from mill towns and farm communities describe the same pattern over and over. A mother packing whatever sat closest to the icebox door that morning, because in that house, nothing sat long enough to spoil. Number 19 was built for men who went underground before the sun came up, a gravy poured over bread already soaked in lard and water, and it had nothing to do with breakfast as anyone eats it today. Number 17 came from a plant that grows wild in ditches and gets sprayed out of yards now. And if you didn't boil it exactly right 3 times, draining every time, it could put you in the ground instead of feed you. If you've ever stretched a paycheck to the last day, eaten alone with the radio on for company, or wondered what your grandmother actually packed for lunch back when there wasn't a choice, this one's for you. Hit subscribe because we dig up one of these forgotten kitchens every week, and half of what you're about to hear never made it into a single cookbook. And if your family had one of these sandwiches on the table too, drop the name in the comments. I read every one, and some of the best entries on future lists come straight from you. Let's start at 19. Number 19 is the Bulldog Gravy over water sandwich. And it wasn't dessert, it wasn't a snack. It was breakfast for a man about to spend 10 hours underground. Bread got soaked in lard and water until it went soft and heavy, then covered in a gravy made from flour, grease, and whatever milk or water was on hand that morning. 1 skillet, 1 pan, maybe 8 minutes total, because there wasn't time for more than that before the whistle sounded and a man had to already be walking toward the mine entrance. The cost barely registered. Flour and grease were already in the house, charged against the family's tab at the company store. So this dish cost almost nothing extra to make, and it didn't add a single new line to a bill that was already stretched thin. It filled 2 gaps at once. A miner needed enough fat and starch in him to survive a shift with no real lunch break underground, and his wife needed something she could make fast in the dark before he left, without waking the rest of the house or lighting more than 1 burner. The smell was lard hitting a hot skillet before the sun was even up, sharp and smoky, filling a house that had no other heat source running yet, the only warmth in the room besides the bodies still asleep upstairs. In coal camps across Appalachia, wives and mothers made the same gravy hundreds of mornings a year, sitting at a stove that hadn't fully warmed, listening for the whistle that meant their husband or son had to be out the door, timing the gravy to be ready the exact moment he needed to leave. It wasn't a recipe passed down for flavor. It was passed down because it worked every single time, on no money and no time at all, and because a man couldn't survive a 10-hour shift on an empty stomach, no matter how tired his wife already was. Number 18 is the coal-fired toasted cheese sandwich, and it comes from households that didn't have an oven to toast anything in, let alone a stove built for more than heating a room. The filling was grated cheese mixed with mustard and paprika, spread between 2 slices, then held directly over open coals on a fork or a flat iron until it browned and started to bubble at the edges. No sliced cheese, no broiler, just a fire that was already burning for heat and a family finding a second use for it before the coals cooled down for the night. It cost whatever a block of cheese cost that week, stretched by grating it fine instead of slicing it thick, so a small amount covered several sandwiches instead of just 1 or 2. This solved a real problem for houses running on a single hearth or wood stove with no separate cooking apparatus. You cooked with the fire you already had, not a fire you built specifically for food, because building a second fire meant burning fuel nobody could spare. The sandwich came out with a smoky char along one edge that a modern toaster could never reproduce, uneven and a little blackened in spots. And that char was the whole appeal. Proof the fire had done its job. Families who cooked this way weren't choosing a technique out of preference. They were using the only heat source in the house for everything it could possibly do, squeezing a second function out of a fire that was already burning anyway. Number 17 carries a warning label for a reason. The poke salad sandwich came from pokeweed, a plant that grows wild along fence lines and ditches across the South. And it is toxic if you don't prepare it correctly. No exceptions and no shortcuts allowed. Families boiled the young leaves, drained them, boiled them again, drained them again, sometimes a third time, before they were safe to eat. Skip a step and you were looking at vomiting, cramping, worse, all from a plant that looked harmless enough growing along a fence. Despite that, people ate it anyway because it grew for free, where store greens cost real money. And a free vegetable that required labor instead of cash was still a better trade than no vegetable at all, especially in a season when nothing else green was affordable. The gap it filled was seasonal and financial at once. Greens were expensive or unavailable most of the year, but pokeweed showed up on its own every spring whether a family had $2 or 2 cents to their name. The smell after that third boil was faintly bitter, almost like spinach gone sharp, and the texture went soft and dark. Nothing like the crisp leaves that had been picked that morning. Grandmothers across the rural South taught daughters exactly how many boils were enough, counting the water changes out loud sometimes, because getting it wrong wasn't a bad meal. It was a trip to see whoever passed for a doctor in town, if a doctor was even within reach. That kind of knowledge doesn't survive without someone deciding it mattered enough to pass on. One kitchen at a time, one daughter at a time. This wasn't just cheap food. It was how a family with almost nothing made it through the week without anyone going hungry. One sandwich at a time, one small decision after another that most people never had to think twice about. Number 16 is the Lenten sandwich, a genuine meatless fasting day recipe built around ground walnuts and hard-boiled egg whites, bound together and spread with a mixture of yolk, vinegar, and mustard that gave the whole thing some bite. Households observing meatless days, whether for religious fasting or because meat simply wasn't in the budget that week, and often it was both at once, needed something with enough substance to feel like a real meal without a scrap of meat anywhere in it. The walnuts brought fat and protein, the egg whites brought bulk, and the yolk vinegar mustard spread brought enough sharpness that the whole thing didn't taste like penance, even if that's exactly what it was meant to represent. It solved a specific problem for families balancing religious obligation against hunger. Lent didn't pause anyone's appetite, and a sandwich that filled you up without breaking the fast was worth having on hand every single Friday for weeks at a stretch. Sometimes the same recipe repeated without complaint. The texture was dense and slightly grainy from the ground nuts. Nothing like the soft white bread sandwiches around it on the same table. A noticeably different bite that marked the day as different from the rest of the week. Home cooks kept this recipe in the same worn recipe box as everything else, filed under a season rather than an ingredient, because that's how the calendar ran their kitchen as much as their pocketbook did, dictating what could and couldn't sit on the table that day. Number 15 is the carrot and peanut mystery sandwich. Chopped raw carrot and salted peanuts bound in mayonnaise between 2 slices. And yes, this was a real published scientific nutrition recipe. Not a joke and not an exaggeration for the sake of a good story. Home economics extension bulletins in the 1920s and 30s were pushing hard to get more vegetables into the American diet. And disguising a carrot inside a sandwich filling was one strategy they actually printed and distributed to households across the country as a serious recommendation. It cost almost nothing. A carrot, a handful of peanuts, a spoonful of mayonnaise stretched the whole thing further than any of its parts alone would have gone by itself. The gap it filled wasn't just financial. It was nutritional messaging aimed at housewives who were told, correctly or not, that their families weren't eating enough vegetables and that hiding one inside something familiar and already accepted was the fix. Bite into it, and you got a strange crunch against the softness of mayonnaise and bread. Carrot and peanut fighting for the same bite, neither one quite blending into the other the way the bulletin probably promised it would. Home cooks who tried it weren't chasing flavor so much as chasing a bulletin's promise that this was good for the kids, trusting the paper more than their own instincts about what belonged in a sandwich. Whether the kids agreed is a different story, and most of them probably didn't. Number 14 is the American cheese sandwich, and the cheese itself exists because someone needed a version of cheese that could be made cheap, fast, and shelf-stable at a scale no farmhouse wheel of cheddar could ever match. Processed American cheese was patented and mass-produced specifically to solve the problem of real cheese spoiling before a poor family could finish it. It melted evenly, it kept longer, and it cost less per slice than anything aged or imported. 2 slices of bread, 1 slice of cheese, sometimes butter if there was any to spare that week. No cooking required at all, no waiting and no mess to clean up afterward. The gap it filled was storage and shelf life in homes without reliable refrigeration. A wheel of cheddar could mold before a family of 6 worked through it. But processed cheese sat safely for weeks without turning, wrapped in its own paper on a shelf. The smell was mild, almost waxy, nothing like the sharpness of real aged cheese. And that blandness was actually part of the design, built to please everyone at the table and offend no one, including child in the house. It became the default lunch of an entire generation of American school children, not because it tasted better than anything else on the shelf, but because it never went bad on the walk to school, no matter how warm the weather got by afternoon. Number 13 is the onion sandwich, just onion, butter, and bread. And it was more popular during this era than most people today would ever believe walking past an onion bin in a modern grocery store. When meat, cheese, and other toppings were hard to come by, or simply too expensive that week, a raw onion sliced thin and buttered generously became dinner. No substitute needed and no complaints allowed at the table. It cost pennies, since a single onion could stretch across several sandwiches for several people. One vegetable doing the work an entire meat course would have done in a better week. The gap it filled was blunt and practical. When the icebox was empty and payday was still days off, onion and butter were often the only 2 things guaranteed to be in the house, sitting there reliably, no matter how bad the week had gotten. The smell was sharp enough to announce itself across a room the moment the knife hit the cutting board, and the taste bit back at whoever ate it. No softness anywhere in the bite, nothing gentle about it at all. Families didn't romanticize this one, and nobody pretended it was a treat. It showed up on the table because nothing else could, and everyone at the table understood exactly what that meant without a word being said out loud. Number 12 is the peanut butter and pickle sandwich, a combination that sounds strange today, but made real sense to anyone doing physical labor on a tight budget and an even tighter clock. Peanut butter brought dense fat and protein, and pickle brought a jolt of vinegar and salt that cut straight through the heaviness, keeping the whole bite from feeling like a brick in the stomach. It cost almost nothing, a spoonful of peanut butter, a slice or 2 of pickle already sitting in a jar in the icebox from some earlier meal. And it delivered fast, portable energy for men and women working fields, mills, or factory floors on a short lunch break that couldn't afford to run long. The gap it filled was speed and stamina. A worker with 20 minutes needed calories that hit immediately, not a meal that required sitting down and digesting slowly before getting back to the line or the field. The crunch of the pickle against the thick pull of peanut butter was the whole appeal. Salt and vinegar and fat all fighting in the same bite, waking a tired mouth back up halfway through a shift. It wasn't elegant, and nobody claimed it was. It was fuel built for people who didn't have the luxury of eating for pleasure on a workday, only the luxury of getting back to work with enough energy to finish it. Number 11 is the peanut butter and mayo sandwich. And if one flavor combination defines this entire era of American eating, this is it, more than any other item on this whole list. Peanut butter had become cheap and widely available, in part because of decades of agricultural promotion in the South, pushing peanuts as a rotation crop, work most closely associated with the agronomist George Washington Carver, whose research helped drive peanuts into Southern farming, and eventually into American kitchens at a price nearly anyone could afford, rich or poor. Mayonnaise added fat and moisture to a spread that could otherwise sit dry and heavy in the mouth, turning something stiff into something a person could actually swallow without water nearby. It cost only a few cents a sandwich, and one jar of peanut butter could feed a family lunch for a week or more, stretched further than almost anything else in the pantry. The gap it filled was almost universal. Protein was expensive nearly everywhere in the country. Peanut butter was not, and mayonnaise made a cheap spread taste closer to something rich, something a family could feel a little proud to put on the table. The texture alone made it memorable. Thick, sticking to the roof of the mouth, softened just enough by the mayonnaise to go down easy without a fight. This wasn't a novelty sandwich, and nobody treated it as one. For an entire generation of American children, this was simply what lunch was, day after day, without question. Number 10 is the deviled ham sandwich, built from potted meat that came out of a can and showed up constantly in relief kitchens and government ration boxes during the hardest years of the Depression. It required no cooking at all, spread straight from the tin onto bread, sometimes with a little mustard if there was any left in the jar. The cost was set by whatever the relief agency or grocer charged for the smallest available can, and one tin could be stretched across several sandwiches for several people if spread thin enough. The gap it filled was pure availability. When fresh meat wasn't affordable or simply wasn't in the house, a shelf-stable can of processed meat paste was often the only protein a family had access to at all. The smell coming off the tin was sharp and metallic, almost salty enough to sting, and the texture was smooth in a way that didn't resemble any cut of meat a person could point to. Families receiving relief supplies didn't get to choose what came in the box. This is what showed up, and this is what fed people. Number 9 is the pimento cheese sandwich, once considered plain, frugal Southern food and now sold in delis as something close to a delicacy. Proof that what's fashionable and what's desperate can end up being the exact same recipe decades apart. Shredded cheese, chopped pimento peppers, and mayonnaise made a spread that stretched a small amount of real cheese much further than slicing it plain ever could. It cost less than buying enough sliced cheese for the same number of sandwiches, since grating and binding the cheese with mayonnaise multiplied its volume. The gap it filled was economic. A Southern family could afford a little cheese, but not enough to feed everyone slice by slice, and this recipe solved that math. The texture was soft and slightly tangy from the pimento, spreadable in a way sliced cheese never could be. Today, it runs $8 a container in a specialty grocery store. The same recipe that once existed purely because a family couldn't afford anything better. This stopped being about money somewhere along the way. It became about refusing to go without, taking a can, a jar, a single vegetable, and turning it into something that still counted as a meal, on purpose, every time. Number 8 is the sardines and mayo sandwich, canned protein stretched about as far as protein could go. A small tin of sardines, mashed with mayonnaise to bulk it out and soften the strong fish flavor, spread thin across bread. The cost was set by the price of the smallest can on the shelf, and mashing the fish with mayonnaise let one tin cover more sandwiches than eating the sardines plain ever would. The gap it filled was specific to communities near fishing industries and mill towns, where canned fish was cheap, plentiful, and one of the only reliable protein sources on a factory wage. The smell was strong and briny, impossible to hide even under mayonnaise, and it marked a lunch pail from across a room. Workers in mill towns carried this to their shifts because it was filling, portable, and didn't need refrigeration until the moment it was opened. Nobody claimed to love the smell. They ate it anyway because a filling lunch on a factory wage wasn't a given. Number 7 is the cucumber and mustard sandwich. Sliced cucumber and a smear of mustard or mayonnaise between 2 pieces of bread. Built specifically for hot weather and heavy labor. It cost next to nothing. A single cucumber from a garden or a roadside stand covered several sandwiches, and it filled a gap that heavier food couldn't. Laborers working outdoors in summer heat didn't want a dense, greasy lunch sitting in their stomach through an afternoon shift. Cucumber brought cool moisture and crunch. Mustard brought a sharp bite that cut through the blandness. And together they made a lunch that didn't weigh a worker down before the hardest hours of the day. The sound of the bite was crisp, almost watery. Nothing like the dense chew of a meat sandwich sitting in the same lunch pail on other days. Farm hands and field workers reached for this one specifically in July and August, when the temperature made a heavier lunch feel like punishment rather than fuel. Number 6 is the bread and butter sandwich, plain enough that it sounds like an afterthought, but it was a documented regular lunch item, served in the White House kitchen during the Depression, and served on school lunch menus to children across the country at the exact same time. 2 slices of bread, a spread of butter, nothing else. And that was considered a complete, acceptable lunch at the highest levels of American public life during the hardest economic years the country had faced. It cost almost nothing to make, since bread and butter were staples already in nearly every kitchen. The gap it filled was symbolic as much as practical. When even a household associated with the federal government was serving stripped-down meals, it signaled to the country that austerity wasn't shameful. It was simply what the moment required of everyone. The texture was soft throughout, nothing to chew against, nothing to distract from how little was actually there. School children ate this same sandwich in cafeterias from one coast to the other, and most of them understood, even at 8 or 9 years old, exactly why it was on the tray. Number 5 is the mashed potato sandwich, built from whatever potatoes were left over from the night before, spread cold or slightly warmed between 2 slices of bread when meat and eggs had run out entirely. It cost nothing extra at all. The potatoes were already cooked, already paid for, and this sandwich existed purely to make sure none of them went in the trash. The gap it filled was about waste as much as hunger. A family that had already spent money on potatoes wasn't going to let a half cup of leftovers go bad in the icebox while people went without lunch the next day. The texture was dense and starchy, almost paste-like against the bread, filling in a way that sat heavy in the stomach for hours. Mothers across the country made this one without a recipe, because it wasn't really a recipe. It was just what happened to potatoes that didn't get finished the first time around. Number 4 is the cold hot dog and ketchup sandwich. Leftover franks sliced and laid on bread cold, straight from the icebox, never reheated. It cost nothing beyond what the hot dogs had already cost the night before, and reheating them wasn't worth the fuel or the time when they could be eaten exactly as they were. The gap it filled was speed and thrift together. A family that had bought hot dogs for one meal wasn't going to waste the leftovers, and a cold sandwich required no stove, no time, and no extra ingredient beyond a squeeze of ketchup. The texture was firm and slightly rubbery from sitting cold, nothing like a hot dog eaten fresh off a grill, and the ketchup did most of the work carrying flavor across the bite. Kids carried this in lunch pails without complaint, because a cold hot dog sandwich still beat an empty lunch pail by a wide margin. This was never shame. It was people refusing to waste a single scrap of what they'd already paid for and building a meal out of it anyway. Number 3 is the raw onion and mustard sandwich. Cheap, durable, and sharp enough to clear your sinuses along with your hunger. Raw onion sliced thin, a spread of mustard, 2 pieces of bread. That was the entire recipe, and it cost only what a single onion cost that week, stretched across as many sandwiches as it would slice into. There was no cooking involved at all, no stove to light, no fuel to spend, which mattered just as much as the price of the onion itself. The gap it filled was purely economic. Onions kept for weeks without spoiling and cost almost nothing compared to meat or cheese, making this one of the most reliable lunches a family could count on when the budget ran thin and payday still felt a long way off. Laborers carried it to job sites because it didn't need refrigeration and didn't spoil in a lunch pail sitting in the sun through a full shift outdoors. The bite hit hard and fast, sharp onion against sharper mustard, strong enough that a person's eyes where they'd even finished chewing, and the smell clung to a person's hands long after the sandwich was gone. Nobody mistook this for a treat, and nobody pretended otherwise at the table. It was what got a working person through an afternoon on almost no money at all, one more day stretched out of a grocery bill that had almost nothing left in it. Number 2 is the butter and sugar sandwich, and in a house with no real treats, this was the closest thing to one. Butter spread thick, sugar sprinkled generously on top, folded between 2 slices of bread. That was it, and it cost only what a spoonful of sugar and a smear of butter added up to, which in most houses was already sitting in the pantry, waiting to be used on something. There was no trip to a store required, no special occasion needed to justify it. Just a mother deciding a day called for it. The gap it filled wasn't hunger so much as morale. Children who never saw a store candy or a slice of cake still needed something sweet once in a while. And this sandwich delivered that without a single extra purchase or a single extra penny spent. The texture went gritty from the sugar against the softness of the butter, and the sweetness hit fast and simple. Nothing complicated about it. Nothing that needed explaining to a child too young to understand why cake wasn't in the house. Mothers made this one specifically to give their kids a small win on an otherwise hard day. A 5-minute sandwich standing in for every dessert the family couldn't afford. And for a lot of kids, that was enough to make the day feel a little less thin. Number 1 is the ketchup sandwich, and it earns the top spot because it says more about this era than any other item on this list. Bread with ketchup spread across it, sometimes sugared and toasted, to push it closer to a dessert. Sometimes eaten exactly as it sounds, plain, thin, and red, with nothing else between the slices at all. It cost almost nothing, since a bottle of ketchup lasted through weeks of sandwiches made this way, stretched far past what anyone buying it would have expected. It filled a gap that had nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with getting a child through a meal when there was truly nothing else in the house to put between 2 slices of bread, no cheese, no meat, no butter even. The taste was sharp and tangy, sweet enough at the edges to trick a hungry kid into thinking they were eating something closer to a real meal than they were, at least for the length of the sandwich. Children who grew up eating this one rarely forgot it, not because it tasted good, but because they understood, even young, exactly what its presence on the table meant about the week their family was having. And some of them never touched ketchup the same way again as adults. The thread running through all 19 of these sandwiches was never the recipes themselves. It was what people did with almost nothing: a jar, a can, a single vegetable, a heel of bread, and refused to let go to waste, turning scraps into something that still counted as a real meal at a real table. The currency that ran these kitchens wasn't money, because most of these families didn't have much of it to begin with. It was memory, necessity, and a kind of quiet dignity that showed up in the smallest decisions, like grating cheese instead of slicing it, or boiling a wild plant 3 times instead of giving up on it and going hungry that day. Most of that knowledge is gone now, replaced by convenience nobody has to think twice about, and by a grocery store that never runs out of anything. Pick one of these this week: the pimento cheese, the peanut butter and pickle, even the plain bread and butter, and eat it slow, the way it was never meant to be rushed through, even when everything else in that house was running short. And see if you notice what your grandparents noticed every single day.